Welcome to another episode of the Three Presbyteers. On this episode, we're going to be discussing the question, is it impolite to talk about politics and religion? I'm Josh Owen, and as usual, I'm accompanied by my fellow Presbyteers, brothers.
Robert Rothwell.
Aaron Garriott.
All right, well, one of our members brought this question to us, asking about where does this idea come from? And I don't know that we necessarily have a definitive answer on the origins of this ethos, but I thought we might discuss, first of all, the question of, is it impolite to talk about politics and religion? And I'm going to throw out there that it really depends on who you're with, who you're talking to, as to whether or not that's going to be considered impolite. When I'm with my family, that's not considered impolite. When I'm in the company of some of my neighbors, they would probably consider it impolite, maybe a little rude to bring up anything that might stir controversy. But when I'm with my church family, that also can vary. You know, some members of the church family might feel like, hey, I'd rather not talk about that. That's a subject off limits, particularly politics, not so much religion when I'm with the church family. But then I think, in addition to that question, is it impolite? Should we not do it? Like, okay, so yes, of course, I'm going to go ahead and roll with it when I'm with my family. I'm going to roll with talking religion when I'm with my church. That's an obvious one. Most of the time, I'm going to not be afraid to talk politics when I'm with my church family. But even if it is impolite, if it is a little uncomfortable, should that stop us from broaching those subjects? What say you, brothers?
Well, I think you kind of said this already without saying it, but I think it's going to be very context specific. So, I mean, if you have a neighbor that has told you, hey, I don't want to chat about politics, right? It's probably unwise for you to bring it up. Now, if they bring it up, that might be a different story. Or even religion to a degree. I think there it's a little different, because you are looking for opportunities to share the gospel, and they may make a comment that you could segue. But, you know, I think it's probably generally wise that if someone says, hey, I don't want to talk about that right now, to respect their choice, because otherwise you could end up just losing an opportunity to do it again in the future.
So then you just kind of snarkily say, well, so then how's the weather up where you are?
That's right. Oftentimes when people say they don't want to talk about politics, they have a certain narrow definition of politics. Mm-hmm. But politics, historically speaking, which we'll get into, is a lot broader than simply who's running for office this year. Mm-hmm. And so along with politics and religion really can't be as separate as people think that they can be, because morality can't be separated from politics, which morality can't be separated from religion. Mm-hmm. And it's often said that if you don't talk about politics or religion, what are you going to talk about? And I think there's some truth to that while I'm not advocating going around talking about your favorite politician who's running for office, it is near impossible in our day and age, especially with the news cycle and how much news we're inundated with, to avoid it altogether. Mm-hmm. And so to the answer,
I feel like why did you look at me? Look, I like Ron DeSantis, okay? And I can't help it that I just want to talk about him.
I love Ron DeSantis too, but you know, his hair makes us look like weak men. And so when you bring up Ron DeSantis all the time, it makes me feel like a weak man.
Really?
Yeah.
I think a truly strong man is a bald man.
I was hoping you would say that, Robert. Yeah. That's why I love you. That's why you're in the middle. So no, it is not impolite to talk about politics as long as you're not a jerk about it.
Right.
Yeah. So I have a neighbor that spends half the year here, but he is a citizen of Canada.
Sorry.
So he has to spend a little over half the year there. So I guess technically he doesn't spend half the year here. Close to it, though. And we were, he had a conversation with my son one time where the topic of religion came up, and my son disagreed with him on evolution. And he tried to offer some, sort of consensus argument, the scientific community is, in lockstep agreement about this subject.
Not really.
So, we can't be anti-science, right? And Ben offered some pushback to that, with some apologetic moves that he's learned in his Ligonier jiu-jitsu classes. And so later the guy felt bad, and he came over and he lodged an apology with everyone in my family, each of us separately, because he couldn't catch us all at once. He apologized to Renee, and Renee's like, hey, it's kind of weird, he come over and apologized to us. And I'm like, and then he comes, he finds me and he apologizes to me. And I'm like, dude, I said, you've got nothing to apologize for. You and Ben disagreed.
Right.
You didn't hit one another. You weren't yelling at one another. You just had a disagreement. He's like, well, I just need to learn to, remember who I'm talking to and really just kind of follow the rule.
Sounds like a Canadian.
It's impolite to talk politics and religion. And I stopped him right there and I said, hey, that's very un-American. I said, maybe that's the rule in Canada. But I said, you know who doesn't want us to talk about politics and religion, don't you? The elites.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want us getting any big ideas, so it's best for us not to discuss these important matters. But, let's just keep it to the mundane of, sports, weather, and, how each one of your children are doing.
Right.
But let's not talk about any big ideas.
But where did that mindset come from? What events in society, what historical events, what ideas do you guys think have fostered this mindset that your neighbor was positing?
Well, I mean, somebody said at the outset, maybe it was you, Josh, that getting a solid answer to that question, that specific question, might be difficult. But I do think one of the things that contributes to it is kind of the and Josh is right. Talking about politics and religion is typically, you're generally not considered impolite in America, at least in a lot of circles. But I do think there's something to be said about how the so-called American experiment with religious plurality, even if religious plurality may not have been what the founders intended, but that's what we ended up with, where we've just kind of decided to live at peace with each other and not fight over religious differences. And I think that's kind of something that's just kind of etched into us, I think, as Americans, that we, if you talk about it, you might end up fighting about it.
Yeah.
And we don't want to fight about it because the Constitution gives us freedom of religion. So let's just all agree to disagree and get along, so to speak. I do think there's something, I may not be phrasing it in the most eloquent way, but I do think there's something there.
Yeah. And I think maybe an answer, to that for a Christian who might prefer a pluralistic environment for America, because there are many who do. That's a very standard traditional Baptist position, is they prefer a pluralist public square. That doesn't mean that Baptists have been quiet in the public square. It just means they prefer that there would be toleration.
But would they phrase it like that? Would they say they prefer pluralism, or would they say like separation of church and state?
Well, they would frame it in probably separation of church and state, thus leaving the public square a kind of open forum for all the different religious and philosophical views to compete in an open market.
And what is the open market now? What's the public square but social media?
Yeah.
Today, that's the public square.
Yeah. But I think what we need to do, and I think that a lot of Baptists do this well. So they would like embrace the idea of pluralism and religious tolerance, right? But they do so in a way that says, I can tolerate you while I disagree with you, right? We can tolerate one another while we argue vociferously for what we believe, right? And toleration would simply mean I am not going to penalize you for holding to what you believe, even though it's different than what I believe. So I think, even though I'm not really a fan of this pluralism and of just complete religious toleration, if we're using religion in terms of all the world's religions, I'm certainly in favor of the toleration of Christians under different banners, right? But I'm not a big fan of religious pluralism. But if I were, I think we need to keep in mind is that toleration does not demand that we not talk about religion.
And I think one of the things we're up against is that this more recent idea that toleration equals agreement, right? There's kind of this idea that it's inherently rude to disagree with someone. And I mean, you kind of got at that talking to your neighbor, right? Of course you can be rude while you disagree with someone, but the mere fact of a disagreement does not make one intolerant or not,
And some of this idea of religious pluralism, which then leads to the problem of people saying it's rude to talk about religion, goes back even earlier than the establishment of America. It goes, into all the wars over religion, which in many instances, well, you could go back to the Crusades, but I guess I'm talking about more like Christian on Christian, wars in Europe, that people just more or less got burned out, like Protestant, Catholic, warring with one another over who's going to control what territory and what's the religion going to be in that territory. And then people just kind of like burning out with all of that and just saying, you know what, in order to not fight over this anymore, let's kind of reduce this to something that we can all agree is not so essential to our living our lives together. We can live our lives together without this question. And so let's relegate that to, a bottom.
Lowest common denominator.
And so, if we're looking for like kind of reasons why, these things, sometimes it's that those kind of social experiences, that society has had together where they kind of come up with a consensus that says, look, this has created a lot of strife. If we don't want to have strife, then let's not talk about this.
And that's that discussion of even post-war consensus has come up a lot recently with post-World War II consensus. We don't need to get into all of that, but there is something to the idea that post-World War II, the idea of globalism kind of was more in line with what people wanted to advocate for than the nationalism, individualism kind of won out, and so there's this idea that any sort of patriotism is bad. Any sort of disagreement over religion is going to lead to another Hitler. All of these kind of things that fall under that post-war consensus, those ideas, I think have led to this hyper-individualist culture where nothing is on the table that we could possibly disagree with. And I think it's a sign of Christian immaturity to not be able to dwell with people in unity where there's minor disagreements. I mean, shoot, we disagreed today on things. Josh and I had an argument today about whether the papacy was the Antichrist. I said yes, he says no. We can have an episode on that later. But we can dwell in unity with those things. It's also a sign of Christian immaturity, I think, to be able to dwell in unity with people with whom you share nothing in common. Like you can't even talk about the basic fundamentals of what life's about. That's also a problem. And so both of those, I think, are signs of immaturity.
Right.
But all that to say, Josh, I think you're exactly right. Historically, those religious wars in Europe, kind of post-Reformation, Enlightenment, were big igniters to this ideology of globalism and pluralism.
And within Reformed Presbyterianism, we have what we call the spirituality of the church. And while we would all agree on the spirituality of the church and our mission, sometimes that's interpreted differently, right? So I don't interpret that in a way that would lead me to be uninvolved in politics, or that would lead me, even as a pastor, not to speak out about political issues. Okay. Like, I don't feel like the spirituality of the church means, hey man, stay in your lane and don't talk about abortion, because that's a political issue.
Yeah.
Don't talk about gay marriage, because that's a political issue. I'm like, no, Christ isn't relegated to 1 or 2 or 3 spheres of our life. He is Lord of all things, right? And so we want to flesh that out in our biblical teaching, and he's the Lord of our nation, right? And so I'm going to talk about those things, but there are some who interpret the language of the spirituality of the church to mean that as a church, in our institutional gathering, if you will, in identity, that we don't talk politics, period.
That hyper spirituality of the church is a result of a wedge being driven between the spiritual and the material. It's kind of neo-Gnostic.
Right.
It's an adoption of the idea that whatever is spiritual belongs to Christ, but whatever is material belongs to this world. And therefore, pastors who are ministers of word and sacrament cannot address things of the body politic, material realm. And that's not, I think, what the best of our forefathers meant when they talked about the spirituality of the church.
No, certainly not. I mean, if you just look at all the Reformed confessions, typically there's a section in there about the relationship between the magistrate and the church, and there is a kind of a separation of church and state, right? But it's not a separation that says, each has a mission, right? We as the church have a mission to preach the gospel, minister sacraments, make disciples, right? And the state's job is to preserve civic order, right? And so but that doesn't mean that those two realms have no contact with each other or have nothing to say to each other, or that, right, the magistrate can fail at its duty.
Each one has a duty to the other.
Right. There you go. That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah. In fact, the Westminster Confession says that who is the nursing mother of the church?
No, nursing father.
I say father.
It's father, isn't it?
Is
It
it
is
father?
nursing father, which is kind of weird to
That
say.
is weird. Yeah.
But that's what it says.
We need to make a
nursing
revision to that.
father. Yeah.
We don't know our genders in the Westminster. But what do the standards mean by that?
I think they're thinking of men who are like, getting up in their years and things are getting a little flappy. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh, I thought they were talking about bottle feeding.
That might work too.
Okay.
We're going to strike that. Sorry, Gabe. We just created more work for you.
Yeah. Well, to answer the question, my understanding is that it's basically the state is supposed to conduct itself in a way that's conducive to the church is doing its own mission, right?
Yeah. And even to support the church.
Right.
Now, what that support looks like, that's where the disagreement lies with certain political theology camps. But I think we all agree that the state is to be supportive of the church of our common Lord.
Right. And, I would argue that the state is to do that, understanding that it is a servant of God, who is administrating this world through the kingdom of Christ, through the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so there's an acknowledgement of that in the special care of the church that does not necessarily translate into the care for all world's religions. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier in terms of toleration.
So you're saying that we shouldn't be as welcoming of a mosque being built down the road as we are to a Reformed Presbyterian church?
Right.
But
exactly.
That's
not just we, but that our city council, while they may make special provisions and do some rezoning to help a church get established in a community, that they would not offer that level of support and cooperation to a mosque or to, say a Hindu temple. So
that cuts against the plurality principle.
Absolutely.
Josh.
Well, that's why I said earlier, I'm not a pluralist in that sense.
Yeah. We believe in plurality, a plurality of elders.
This is true.
So that's a bad Presbyterian joke.
Yeah.
So hyper spirituality of the church, yes, it is, and we can blame some of our Presbyterian forefathers for that. Some of our Southern Presbyterian guys that we love did, I think, for their own convenience when it came to
certain issues,
slavery in particular. They advocated for this hyper spirituality of the church so that they had a license then to not interfere with an immoral practice that was common in their day.
And I'm speaking above my pay grade here when I talk about this, because I'm not a church historian. I'm certainly not an expert on J. Gresham Machen, but you know, he came out, you know, he had that divided, you know, with the guys who went with the Bible Presbyterian Church over the question of the kind of fundamentalist objection to alcohol and prohibition. And, you know, he appeals more to the spirituality of the church, just to say, hey, we're not going to make that a policy. We're just not going to deal with it. We're not going to speak to it one way or another. Whereas, you know, I personally would simply say it is a matter of Christian liberty.
Right.
And, you know, we shouldn't, you know, be creating laws that are more restrictive than what God's law is in the enjoyment of the things that he has given us, that we're to receive them, you know, with thanksgiving from his hand. And of course, to use them in moderation with self-control, right? That's, but, you know, if you know, the answer is, well, you know, from the other side, well, people can't exercise self-control and therefore the government has to exercise it for them. That's when I think we need to be able to speak clearly and say that's an overreach of government authority. You know, if we want the government to come in and exercise the virtue of self-control for all of us, that's gonna be a very scary state to live in. It's
tyranny,
right?
It's tyranny,
and it was I think in the era of prohibition. You know, I get the problem that they're trying to address. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But the answer to the problem only created a whole other problem, right?
Yeah.
We don't have time to get into that, but it just kind of goes into the whole
Yeah.
idea of the spirituality of the church and what the church should and should not speak to.
Yeah.
And I think if the church had spoken more clearly and biblically on that issue,
on slavery and alcohol,
I think that we would have, you know, maybe avoided, you know, some of the social conditions that were created.
And if the church were to speak prophetically today about abortion, for example,
that's right,
we would be avoiding the same problems.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. And if they would be willing to put their power right where their beliefs are. So, for example, you know, the Roman Catholic Church says that abortion is murder. Says it's a sin, but they won't excommunicate somebody like Joe Biden, who is a Roman Catholic, practicing, supposedly devout Roman Catholic, but who advocates for abortion. It's not just that he like says, well, I really can't do anything about it. No, he advocates for abortion. And the church won't excommunicate him. So as long as we do that, I don't think we're exercising the power that Christ has entrusted to the church to be salt and light in our nation. Another issue that comes up when we're talking about the impoliteness of talking about politics and, you know, trying to say the hyper spirituality of the church is this false dichotomy between politics and morality. You know, when people try to reduce the legalization of abortion to a political rather than a moral question, or homosexual marriage as merely a political question, that is a moral question. And it's one of those issues that's pretty easy to deal with. So there are other political questions and economic questions that are maybe a little more complex and harder for us. And it may be beyond my knowledge level in my vocation to be able to advise the government on economic policy. But what we need to remind, you know, the government of are the biblical principles that the Bible is very clear on, where we might not be able to necessarily articulate a policy that they need to have in place for economics and so forth. But
I think a good example of that, maybe this is not a good example and you could correct me, but this last political election season, you know, we as a church didn't put out a Trump sign in the front of the church.
We didn't?
Maybe Gabe did secretly. We did put out a vote no on Amendment 4 sign.
Yeah.
Well, what's the distinction there? One is a clear moral issue that makes its way into politics that Christians need to have a clear prophetic voice about. But we wouldn't advocate, say, from the pulpit or from the authority of the church, that you must vote for this or that candidate. We might say you can't in good conscience vote for this candidate, but we would not say from the pulpit, you must vote for this candidate.
Right. Yeah, and that I think gets to the reason for that is that, something like Amendment 4 was pretty clear cut.
So clear. Yeah.
We know that this is going to basically open up the floodgates to abortion at any time for any reason. And we know that we can't countenance that, and that if the state countenance that, it's actually not doing its job, because one of the state's jobs is to protect life, right?
That's its fundamental job. That's the number one, right? I mean, yeah.
But whereas with a political candidate, right, it's a little more complicated, because there might be any number of reasons why you would choose to vote for. I mean, use Trump. So let's use Trump as an example. There might be reasons to vote for him, and there might be reasons why an individual feels like they can't vote for him, right? And and both may have a legitimate case to be made, and so we can't bind a conscience there, because again, I think it's easier to say that voting for candidate X is most certainly unwise and perhaps even sinful, but saying vote for this person is a little more difficult, especially when you have a ballot that might have 10 candidates on it, right? And
but it is easy to say vote no for this amendment that's going to enshrine child sacrifice in our state constitution. That's the clear overlap of politics and morality that Josh is talking about. And some of our forefathers, like Thornwell and so forth, because they advocated for a hyper spirituality of the church theology, they allowed themselves to say, don't put a sign out there to say abolish slavery, because that's a political issue, and the church is about preaching the gospel. That was a failure, I think, of many things, to see that overlap between politics and morality. You can't always separate the two. Sometimes it's less clear, advocating for a 45-mile-per-hour speed limit over 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. That might not have as many moral implications behind it. Something like abortion or slavery does.
Yeah, very good. So I guess then we might have already touched on this, but how should we talk about politics and religion? I mean, some things have already been said along those lines, but can we summarize that discussion in a few points or principles that we want to keep in mind when we're talking with people, especially people that aren't entirely comfortable with it, right? Because I mean, it's easy for me to sit down with my family and just talk about these things, or with Gabe over here, we can get into it about things that we're going to agree on most things anyway. So, except the whole libertarian versus Republican, when are you
going to take that sticker off? My goodness,
this weekend.
Okay.
Well, I think one thing that we could do is to encourage Christians to really have a good idea of what the Bible says is the job of the state. Because I think we do miss that, where there are some key passages, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, talks about honoring the emperor.
I just thought Romans 13 basically said that we should always obey the authorities, never question them.
Wear the mask, Robert. Wear the mask.
Well, those passages do have perhaps some complicated application times, but just getting down the idea that the state's job is to use the sword to punish evildoers, right? That just getting that principle down has a lot to say about, well, what's the state's role for abortion? What's the state's role for terrorism and war and things like that? So I think probably one thing would be to have a good Christian view of politics and not assume that you mentioned the post-war consensus, not assume that the past 50 years of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution is the Christian view on politics. Because I think as Americans, we're kind of inclined to think that way.
So read widely as well. I mean, read some of the past saints on their understanding of political theology. I mean, read Kuyper, read Bavinck, read the Scottish Covenanters. I mean, even, read some of the American Presbyterians' understanding of the founding fathers and the vision of this country.
Mm-hmm.
We read widely, but don't accept everything just because someone said it. But get a robust understanding of what the Bible has to say about politics, and then a robust understanding of what our forefathers had to say about politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll have more have more weight about your conversations, more
Mm-hmm.
gravitas perhaps when you're having these conversations with others, rather than just kind of parroting the ordinary talking points.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have some more historical grounding about you
Mm-hmm.
when you're able to have these conversations. I'd also say, maybe Josh, you can close us out here. I'd also say, when Peter says, always be ready to have a hope an answer for the hope that is within you. And he says, but do it with gentleness and respect, or with fear and respect. So we're not those
Mm-hmm.
who go around slapping people in the face with a newspaper or a Bible saying, get your politics together.
Mm-hmm.
We give an answer for the hope that is in us with gentleness, while respecting the person, even if that person that we're talking to we disagree with on basically every question that you could possibly raise.
Right.
We still respect them as an image bearer of God and speak the truth in love to them.
Yeah. No, that's very well said. And I'll just sort of reinforce that with, Paul's statement that we're to be speaking the truth in love. Now, that does not mean, which I think many people take it to mean, is never say anything that could offend someone. Paul had plenty to say, even within the context of the church,
even to Peter,
that was offensive to people, right? And having to confront sin and name it and deal with it, right? So speaking the truth in love really goes down to, do you love the person that you're talking to? Like, you may disagree with them and you may not love that person as a brother or sister in Christ, but can you love that person as an image bearer, right? That they bear the image of God. And that creates a certain level of reverence for this person as a human being. And that's going to involve being able to respectfully listen. And respectfully listening doesn't mean affirming.
Right.
You don't have to sit there and listen to somebody go, oh yeah. You can actually disagree with the person, but do so respectfully. Give them an honest hearing. Make sure you're understanding what they're saying and where they're coming from, and then try to respond, not by reading what they've said in the worst possible way, not by always reducing what they've said to the most absurd example of what, because these are common ways of really not giving a person a fair hearing. Right. So give them a fair hearing, try to respond to what they actually say, and not jump to some conclusion of what you think they might have meant or where their idea might go. Now, I mean, obviously it's not wrong to help people see maybe some of the consequences of their ideas that they've not thought through, but do it charitably.
Right.
And then, give the open statement of the truth. I love that, concept that Paul, gives us is that we're to give a bold statement, an open statement of the truth, not
we're not clouding
obfuscating.
it.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Clouding is a better word.
Also, just a word to folks as we're entering. We've already celebrated Thanksgiving. We're entering Christmas season now. We might have Christmas dinners and parties with family members we disagree with. It's also important to remember, especially for the younger folks, honor your father and your mother, including those that you might even disagree with them. So, that includes giving them a fair hearing, like you said, Josh, and showing them deference and respect, even if you might disagree with them, but be able to disagree with them in a way that shows my ultimate allegiance is to Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that is expressed in both the truth I'm telling you and how I'm delivering that truth to you.
I think along those lines, I appreciate you going there. Fear can create panic and really bad decision making. And I think when we go into these kind of conversations and settings where we're talking about big issues that we feel strongly about, but sometimes we feel a little inadequate to provide the best answer for it. We don't necessarily feel like I'm not a great apologist. Okay. So it could be a little intimidating, and that intimidation can lead us in some wrong directions. One, it can lead us to just clam up. Okay, well, let's not clam up. The other, though, it can lead us to be angrily aggressive with people. And I think knowing that no matter what our opposition says about anything, Jesus Christ is still Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and he is still the definer of reality. Nothing they say can change that.
Right.
And so you don't need to be afraid. Even if you can't give the best answer back to what they've said, you don't need to be afraid. It's not going to change the reality that who Jesus is, and that, he is the Logos, he is the divine reason that gives definition to what is.
Amen.
Right. So I guess with that, we can just wrap up this discussion. Appreciate the question that came from one of our church members. And we hope that they keep coming, because that really helps to fuel us with
there's
good
such good questions too. My goodness. So impressed with these questions.
We want your questions.
Yeah.
We covet your questions, if I may say that.
You coveting?
I shouldn't say that.
I have questions too. Should I send those to Gabe?
Gabe knows all the answers.
What's the email address, Gabe?
the3presbyteers@gmail.com. And it's the word 3, not the number 3. And the 3presbyteers
and Gabe
@gmail.com.
Gabe will not share your information with telemarketers.
I will not. No.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again for another episode of the Three Presbyteers. And we hope that you were edified by this content. And we'll join us again for another episode. Until then,
walk with the Lord.
7 miles on a dusty road, 2 men travel with a heavy load. Friendly stranger comes and joins the walk, fills their hearts when he starts to talk. Fills a time with words of truth, they don't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Troubled woman sits by the well, sinful past as he can tell. Sits and listens to this Jewish man, already knows and he shares a plan. Living water that'll quench her thirst, she doesn't yet know who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Young and proud, a Pharisee meets the Lord and he couldn't see. Truth is shown and changed his views. Now he knows and he shares the news. Chief of sinners spreads the word. He knows now who he is. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Living word and the bread of life puts to rest all your worldly strife. He's chosen you before it all. Walk with him and you'll never fall. His yoke is easy and his burden's light. All you need to do is walk. Walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord. Gotta walk with the Lord. Walk with the Lord.